Thank you very much, everyone, and pleasure to have you here. My name is Juan de Lara. I'm the director of the Armenian Institute. I've been here for over a year now, and I'm very pleased to have here today Dr. Carel Bertram with me. Dr. Bertram has just recently presented her award-winning book titled A House in the Homeland, Armenian Pilgrimages to Places of Ancestral Memory. I think it was published 2 years ago.
Yes.
And today's talk is inspired in this book, which reflects more than 7 years of research, at least, investigation and documentation of oral histories gathered around different generations of Armenians that have traveled back to Armenia and Turkey in the search of their family origins, their roots, and a better comprehension of their family presence a few generations back. In a way, as Carel will try to explain today, these journeys in the search of ancestral homes are not just journeys to understand and to try to find a property. They are more than that. They are actually spiritual pilgrimages, a way to rediscover their family's resilience subsequent to the trauma, pain, and separation after 1915, the year of the Armenian Genocide. So I should say also some few words about Dr. Bertram. She's a professor emerita of Middle Eastern Studies and Islamic Studies at the Department of Humanities in San Francisco State University. She holds an MA in Near Eastern Studies from UC Berkeley and a PhD in Islamic Art History from UCLA. Focusing on her visual culture of the Ottoman and post-Ottoman eras, she studies how we use space and place to represent ourselves and to create historical consciousness with and beyond our community. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Carel.
Thank you. Double thank you to you, Juan, and also to the Armenian Institute and to people I haven't yet met, Erica Payet and Mariana Papazian, who are somewhere in the ether. In the digital sphere, but they are behind me in all of this. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming and being guests here. It's really a pleasure for me to be here and have a chance to introduce to you my book, House in the Homeland. I have always looked Armenian Pilgrimages to Places of Ancestral Memory. So the Armenians in this book, in the title, are Armenians who either survived the genocide of 1915 and dispersed to various places in the diaspora, or their children and grandchildren. So those are two groups, both the survivors and their descendants, and each had a level of trauma and of mourning that are different but are connected, and both groups considered the Eastern Anatolia as their homeland and a place that they had been exiled from. And it was their homeland since time immemorial, really since before the Ottomans were there. After the genocide and with the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, following World War I, the new Republic of Turkey did not have a clean slate. Instead, it continued denial of the Ottoman genocide. And after, in the immediate aftermath, and for I'd say about 35 years, no one was allowed back into Anatolia. So it was impossible for Armenians to go back and find their houses, see who was left. Their process of denial of the genocide was an attempt to erase the Armenian past. And this destruction was a destruction of their historical presence. So it was a time that was a very physical denial by destroying houses and neighborhoods and monasteries and churches and the names of villages. The strategy was to make it appear as if there had never been Armenians, because if there had never been Armenians, there could have been no genocide. So it's a long-term strategy, and a strategy that has the effect of making it pretty impossible to have a future for Armenians in their homeland. Within about 50 years of the genocide, Armenians, as well as Turkish citizens, started to think of Western Armenia, of historical Armenia, as a place without Armenians. But for Armenians, in their imaginary of this place, it was thick with perpetrators. So in the 50s, when Turkey finally opened Anatolia to travelers and to Armenian travelers who were going back, only a few Armenians dared to go, because to them, it felt like the scariest place on earth. So increasingly over the years, after the 50s, actual survivors and then their children and grandchildren began to make forays into Eastern Anatolia to find their family villages, their towns, and especially they were looking for their houses. William Soroyan was one of those early travelers, and I think it seems that he found his house in Bitlis, and that was in 1960s, early 1960s. So for me, for 9 summers between 2007 and 2015, I traveled with these later travelers in small groups, and we were led by a man named Armin Aroyan from Glendale, California, who had begun to take Armenians to find their houses in about 1990. And can everyone hear me all right? Okay, because you can, I'm available to yell. So it's arguably Armin who began to make the dream of visiting the homeland imaginable and more possible. By the time I joined him, his groups that he took, these small groups, had become his life's work. It was Armin who welcomed me, and I could not have done this work without him. Not only did I travel with him, welcome, but he made me a non-Armenian, someone to trust on these trips. And I think other words, if it had been someone else, I might have had problems, because I am not Turkish, I'm Jewish, but I am a scholar of Turkish history. And so when I would be presented that way, that might have been problematic. But he allowed me to watch what happened on these journeys, and more I watched these journeys with awe and with an increasing reverence. One thing that I found, which I talk about in my book, is that all of the responses that I was watching made clear that these travelers saw their house, or if not their house, their village, or where they had come from, the neighborhood, as their homeland. And they saw the house, though, as its beating heart. And that led to the title of my book, A House in the Homeland. They searched for their houses with anxious expectations, as this was the place where their own histories had taken place. They weren't traveling to recover real estate, although I know that that was a secret wish in many people's hearts, but they were really traveling for spiritual rewards, as you mentioned. And so they called themselves pilgrims, and I call them pilgrims too. In the course of those 9 years, I traveled with over 100 pilgrims and watched what happened when they found their house. And they did find houses, but it's more likely they found what I call their house place, where their house had once been. Either they didn't know where it wasn't there any longer, they didn't have enough information, or perhaps, as I said, they did have that information. But whatever they found, when they were on that ground, they started to feel, as I watched, both happy and fulfilled just by standing in their neighborhood. Just if they had found the tree that Grandpa had talked about, or a fountain that they had heard so much about. I also then enlarged my collection of voices with hundreds of other pilgrims by reading their memoirs or watching home videos or videos that Armin Aroyan had taken, which he shared with me. And so I was able to fill in a lot of information about the pilgrims on the trips that I had missed. And then when I was reading people's books or watching, maybe they had a blog, I often was able to contact them, meet them, and have conversations with them. So my research, in a way, is kind of what I would call a longue durée ethnography. I talked to people, I watched people, I talked to them when they were there, and then I became friends and still am, and found out the depth of their backstories, which I think really gives accuracy to the background stories that are in my book. And it also made this work the deepest honor of my life. So in the end, my insights and the examples of this book are based on over 400 people. Most of whom have become my best friends. So it's changed my life in many ways. In the first part of my book, I write about the people that I call native pilgrims. These are actual survivors who had been born in these villages and had left at an age when they were old enough to have some memories of the village and what had happened to them. So theirs were real pilgrimages of return. Most pilgrims, even descendants, would say, I'm returning, but there is a group of people, the native pilgrims, who actually were returning. So for the natives, by the time I got on these pilgrimages, they were gone. That generation was either gone or they were not up to traveling. So when I write about their experiences, I use what they wrote about their experiences, especially their memoirs, which they wrote about these trips. But the people I'm going to talk about today are the descendant pilgrims, and they're the children and the grandchildren of these survivors. Now, of course, these survivors are going to have descendants that go on for generations, but the descendants that I talk about in my book are a category and a generation of their own, because they lived with their survivor family. They heard their stories, they heard their screams in the night. And so their trips were especially poignant because what they understood had come firsthand. This is the Homeland map that I drew and that I will use. The pilgrims called this area a number of things. Some of them called it historical Armenia. Some of them called it Western Armenia because they wanted to feel it as part of a whole. Some of them called it Armenia, which they found very confusing because they didn't know whether they were in Turkey. They were shocked to find they were in Turkey instead of in Armenia, but that's what their parents had called it. Here's historical Armenia, but seen differently. It colors in Eastern Armenia's Armenian population just before the genocide. And so you can see that this area that is also my map was heavily Armenian, very densely Armenian. And this area also, of course, became a genocide map. And the map shows the routes that were taken by Armenians as they were forced out of their homes and out of their villages on death marches. You'll notice that Istanbul is missing on this map, and to a large extent, Istanbul is missing in my book because, as you see from the map, the genocide was against this population, and that population was in the East. This is a rather simple way of putting it. Now, I've written before, as I said to you, I am a scholar of the end of the Ottoman Empire, beginning of the Turkish Republic, actually an art historian scholar, and I've written before about its places and memory of places, but I wrote from an Ottoman Turkish point of view. But many of these old houses had belonged to Armenians. But most of these Ottoman householders had died in the genocide, and their stories had been erased in the erasure of memory. So that is why Armenians, I had found, had lost their place in history of Eastern Anatolia. So when I found that Armen Aroyan had been taking diasporic Armenians to find, especially to find their villages and their houses, I knew that some important alternative understanding of the past and memory of places was going to be revealed, and it might be a chance for me to write it down. Today, what I'm going to do is a slice of my book. I'll introduce the pilgrim's search for their houses in this land of denial and erasure. And then I will introduce how their own homeland spaces resonated with a very special spirituality in the face of the profane. And third, I'll show how pilgrims responded with to this spiritual space with healing rituals. And last, I will discuss the changing meaning of homeland as pilgrims increasingly met descendants of Armenians who had survived by hiding their histories, either by converting or by being converted or by keeping their mouths closed. And they found that some of these hidden Armenians were in fact their relatives. So first, pilgrims search for their house in a land of denial and erasure. And I start with Marian Kazanjian, whose father was born in Yozgat. He lost his parents and his siblings in the genocide, but he and a young aunt survived, and they were able, I don't know how, to walk all the way to Istanbul, stopping in orphanages, having jobs, but somehow managing to get there, where they were able to make contact with an uncle who had moved to Philadelphia, hoping to get work and either bring his family to America or to go back and help them. After Marianne's father died, her uncle, that uncle who had been in Yozgat, became the source of all her stories. And she said to me, he was my favorite and I was his favorite too. It was very sweet. On our trip, I was amazed. This is like my second trip. I was amazed when Marianne took out this folder of things that she had brought, what I would call material memories or items with stories. She had them all with her. They were copies of a variety of things, including tax records of their house and some hand-drawn maps and a family tree that roots go into Yozgat and all of the people who were in Yozgat that were related to her. And her favorite one was that picture of her father, which she calls the Panama hat picture. And that is her father with his grandparents who owned the house she was looking for, which she knew to be a huge mansion. And I haven't asked her this, but I'm going to assume that that photograph survived because her uncle brought it with him when he crossed the ocean, crossed the Atlantic in 1911. Another prized possession was a painting of the town of Yozgat done by memory by her uncle after he'd reached Philadelphia. And she had brought a copy along because she thought she could use it as a map to find her house. I'm so glad she brought it because then she graciously allowed me to use it as the cover of my book, but it didn't work as a map at all. The river was no longer there. That big building, which she assumed was going to be her house, was actually a government building. But Armen found her house. It was still standing, perfectly intact, but it was now an Ottoman ethnographic museum. And Marianne could never have found it without him, because its history was kind of like a guarded state secret. The brochures, the signage, nothing said anything about an Armenian past. So even though it stood in a formerly Armenian neighborhood, its identity had been totally erased. Armin found it because he was talking to old timers there who called it the Arslanian house, and that was her family's name. So by putting that together, he figured it out. She walked through it, and she had all sorts of magical feelings of, there's a sewing machine here in my family sewed, and she felt like somehow she was in her own past. It was lovely. Her husband, who had great wit, was in the foyer of the house, and he first determined that the guards there, because it's a museum, spoke no English. And then he said to two of them, "This is my wife's house and you're fired." I just thought, what courage he had. Another pilgrim, Muriel, had no such luck in finding her house. Her mother's village of Sak had once been entirely Armenian with a very small church, but when she went, nothing was there, not a foundation stone, let alone a church, and not even the name of the town, Sak, was known. Armin was able to find it. Even every time I would start to map it, I'd have to look all over again to find it. So really, all she could do is stand there, feeling perplexed and sad. But more happened in that story, and so take a look at her picture. I'll talk more about her later. Now, one thing that seemed to emerge that I've already talked about a bit is that every interaction, it feels like every interaction with the places where these families had been, was with a sense of this place's inherent, intrinsic sacredness. And that feeling was revealed as I watched. But along with the sense of the sacred, there was also a sense of the profane. So let me show you how these homeland spaces resonate with that special spirituality in the face of the profane. Carel used a map made by a survivor to find where his father's house had been. So he found the plot, but the house was no longer there. It had been rebuilt, but the garden was there, and he was able to stand in it, kind of like it was the Garden of Eden. I didn't travel with Carel, but I have. You can see that this is from a video. So I really got to listen to what was happening as he was standing there. And he touched every plant and every leaf and remembered how his father had told him that in his town of Husinig, every fruit was large and luscious, and every flower was beautifully colored. So no place in California, where he was from, could have any vegetation that matched this. So he cleverly and kind of sweetly took some of the earth and he said, "I'm going to put this on my flowers when I get home." So Carel had also brought with him, he also had a bunch, not as many, but some memory items. And he brought with him a photograph of his father with his family. And he held that picture when he's standing in the garden. And he says, look, he's holding a book. So he was so proud that his family was an educated family, and the feeling of this household was one of education in what we call the before time, before the genocide. So then he stood up, stood up and he looked around giddily and he said, "I'm back, I'm back," kind of to the spirits of place. But as he walked, he talked to himself. I couldn't hear everything. And after looking around, he stopped and he sighed and he said, I I wonder if they put his head with his body. Whenever I read that, I have to swallow, and we all have to take a deep breath. Carel's father had told him how he had watched in the systematic violence of the genocide, how his own father had been decapitated, and how he had seen his father's head roll along the ground. Every home or hometown that was visited held this kind of dual reverberation of the sacred and the profane. And by profane, I don't mean quotidian or just not sacred. I mean like profanity, which is the way it was used by the philosopher Maurice Halbachs. To him, profane sites are inhabited by the enemies of God, which may even be cursed, and where eyes and ears must be closed. Because, as he said, it was the place where body and soul had been defiled. And yet, because of Carel's attachment to his family and the values they had nurtured, he felt that he was standing on sacred ground. And he even told his wife, if anything happens to me here, be sure that this is the place where they bury me. So the fact that Carel wanted to be buried there shows how one of the most important, prominent markers of the sacrality of the house was it was the place of the family's spirits. The pilgrim Svart from Florida exemplified how pilgrims searched for their houses because of a longing to engage with the spirit of their families, their immediate families. On the bus approaching Sivas or Sapastia, Svart sang a haunting melody, and here translated from the Armenian, in my mind, I yearn to fly to my house where my mother waits for me. My longing is endless. So it seemed clear to her and to many others that to be with her parents' spirit, she would have to travel not just to a homeland, but to a specific place, a house in the homeland, even though her parents, like many survivors, had not died there. Hers had died in Florida. And then she added, until today, my soul wasn't at peace. Now I am at peace. My third example is the Armenian folk singer Hasmik Harutyunyan, who traveled to her ancestral town of Mush and illustrates this same thing, but kind of from the perspective of the ancestor. She said, my grandparents were from Mush. I grew up with them. My whole life is about Mush. And at home, we ate traditional food. We observed traditional days. Everything we celebrated was in the same way that they had done it in Mush. My grandmother and grandfather, they lost their whole family, but somehow they survived. My grandmother lost her first husband and a child, but I grew up with their culture of singing and dancing. Hasmik then recalled that when my grandmother was dying, she said to my father, when I die, please take me home to Mush. And my father said, I can't do that. There's a border. I can't do that. But his mother's response was, what's a border for a dead person? Because a dead person's spirit can fly. And so there is no border for a dead person. I want to add that I learned this from an interview with Hasmik. And when I gave a talk that had this part in it in Glendale a month ago, somebody came up to me and she said, hello, I'm Hasmik. I'm teaching at UCLA this year. I was like, you know, she was an old friend. So every pilgrim was caught in this double reverberation, as I said, of sacred and profane, of joy and pain. And usually added to that was the sadness that the spirits they were going to visit were actually the spirits of their own parents who they had lost in the diaspora. Often they dealt with this pain through rituals. So now we see how a spiritual landscape, we're going to see how a spiritual landscape can encourage rituals. And the first ritual that I'm going to give an example of is collecting holy soil as a relic. So Oski is an example of the ritual of collecting earth on holy ground. And she went to Govdun, which is a satellite village of Sivas. And I am going to need you here because it doesn't go up and down anymore. So while she was, good enough, while she was there, she dug some earth to take home. But I was so glad I was there. That's what makes this whole ethnography worthwhile, is that now I could watch to see what people were doing on the ground, so to speak. And it's what happened that opened my eyes to how these rituals can do their spiritual job. A little background is that 5 years before the genocide, Oski's father, like so many from Ottoman Armenia, had left her mother and their only child and gone to America in search of work. All contact with, they were writing back and forth, but all contact suddenly stopped in 1915 when Oski's mother and child were sent on the death marches. The small daughter died along the way, but her mother survived, eventually made it to Istanbul, where someone helped her get in touch with the husband. Of course, she knew where he was. He brought her to America, and they had 3 more children, and Oski was one of those. That's good. So she found no trace of her home. But she did find, she knew she was in the right town, and she said she found people, Turks who were there, who remembered the Armenians, and some of them even remembered her famous uncle, Sebastasi Murad of Sepasya, who had been a freedom fighter and was very famous. And he was also known for helping Turks in trouble too. So that's why his name had been remembered. And her brother, in fact, was named for him. And so anyway, back to Oski, 3 quarters of a century after her mother had left Govdun, Oski stooped down to dig some soil and put it in a bag. But what I found astonishing was what happened when she started digging. Almost immediately when the scoop that she had brought and hit the soil, she stood up and she looks to the heavens and she starts talking to her mother. Okay, Ma, you got your dream, she said. Ma, I'm here on your land, and I know that you never really ever thought I'd ever come here. You had no idea that I'd come here, but here I am, and I'm beginning to become proud, Ma. I wish you could have come back to see it. In digging the earth, Oski had activated its spirits. She had opened a channel to the transcendent, allowing her to speak to her mother, who'd passed away long before, not here in Govdun, but in Rhode Island. This ritual action changed the meaning of memory and changed the meaning of place. For Govdun now became the place where Oski had talked to her mother. Moreover, she had made herself, implanted herself in Govdun's history, so she was now permanently a part of it. Many people gathered earth as relics with a variety of rewards. There are other rituals as well. I'll now give you the example of an invocation. In the village of Kiri, after finding the place where he thought his house had been, Anush read a speech that he had brought to give to his father who had been murdered in Kiki. He used this earthly opening to the transcendent to tell his father about himself and about all the children, the grandchildren that the father had never met, but who knew about him because he continued talking to them. But most of all, he wanted to introduce his father to his son. So here we see him talking to his father and pointing to his son, just in case the father doesn't know which person it was that he was talking about. So on this holy ground full of spirits, pilgrim after pilgrim invented soul-satisfying rituals that made their ancestors' spirits come alive. These rituals could have happened at no other place than home. Nowhere else could Oski have spoken to her mother. Nowhere else could Anush have introduced his father to his son. And nowhere else could Carel imagine the soil as his final resting place. So there are many ways to parse the idea of homeland. And certainly all of these pilgrims on these house-related trips went to areas that were part of communal memory that belonged to everyone. Especially they went to Ani, they went to Akhtamar, they went to Mount Ararat, among others, but those were the three A's that were tried to be covered. But collective memory is not personal memory. One can sing a Higher Mer in the Church of Akhtamar, or even take some earth from it, but it's not as satisfying, or not satisfying in the same way as being at the place where your history and your stories take place. And that is irreplaceable. Nothing stays the same, of course. The places change and memories change, and the inhabitants of these places change. Pilgrims traveled to today's Turkey, where the only remaining large Armenian community is in Istanbul. Today it has about 60,000 Armenians, some of whom are descendants of survivors from Anatolia. And now there's an influx of Armenians who are coming from Yerevan as well. So there's another layer of population. And Istanbul has its own particular history and a present, which is fraught with many situations they have to deal with, which they renegotiate over and over again. This generation, however, that I'm talking about is centered in Anatolia, and they seemed to find rare, at the beginning anyway, they rarely found any Armenians. In fact, what they found was what I started to call the last Armenian. So they would find the last Armenian of Horhom, and I met the last Armenian of Amasya, and there was the last Armenian of Arapgir. And Armin Aroyam himself had met the last Armenian of Jibin, of his town, and spoke to him in Armenian, and the man had not spoken Armenian for 50 years. But over the last 15, 20, maybe or so years, something that feels shocking and yet also seems rather obvious and inevitable is happening. And this may possibly rewrite the homeland as full of Armenians, like it or not. The beloved Hrant Dink, who was assassinated in 2007, had seen this coming. And this is the appearance over the years of descendants of Armenians who survived the genocide, either by hiding or, as I said, converting or being converted. Araxi from Wisconsin, for example, found a first cousin in her ancestral town of Gezi near Kayseri. And here they are welcoming her. She found the brother of her father. The brother had been left as a toddler, grown up and died, but she found his children, her first cousins, and then all of their children. And they were also excited that the people in Gezi, the family in Gezi, had held like a family reunion for them, called in everybody and made a barbecue. And I told you that I would tell you more about Muriel, so I hope you've been waiting for Muriel, who found that her mostly Armenian town of Sak had been virtually destroyed. So here is that story. There were still Muslims in the small town of Sak, and nearby this emptied area, there were a few houses of Muslims. And a woman came out of that house, and when she was talking to Muriel, Muriel said, "I'm Armenian," and the woman said, "My mother was Armenian." And then she told Muriel that her mother had been saved as a child by a Turkish family and later married to a Turkish man. And then she added, "I remember only," the woman said, "that she always cried." And she said, "And I too was later married to a Turkish man." And she said, I remember that all I did was cry as well." So the woman was in a state of shock, but Muriel was in a state of shock too, because she looked at this woman who was about her age, and she thought, you know, that woman could have been my neighbor. That woman could have been a relative. And then she thought, that woman could have been me. So her attachment to Sak changed immediately. And actually, before this had happened, in 2004, Turkey had a rude awakening that came from a book that was written by Fethiye Çetin, published in 2004, called My Grandmother. And Fethiye Çetin was Kurdish, and she found out as a young teenager that her beloved grandmother was Armenian and had been raised in a nearby village of Havav, but it had been a deep secret. Suddenly, Armenians were coming out of the woodwork, and Turkey was quite shocked. We found more and more of those people, and pretty soon, as you were traveling in Eastern Armenia, you'd come up, people would say, "Oh yes, my grandmother this," mostly grandmothers. Those are the people who survived. Some people would know some Armenian. They could remember some of the names of their grandmothers. More and more of these connections are happening because of DNA tests. On a recent pilgrimage, Laura had used a hand-drawn map, which I have here, to find where her family house had been in Havav, which is the town where Fethiye Çetin's grandmother had come from. The family house had been torn down and replaced, but it was still, the new one was built by two brothers who still lived there. And here they are with Laura, who is holding one of their grandchildren. The brothers remembered that their grandmother had been Armenian, so they were not at all surprised when an Armenian came looking for the house. And one of the brothers agreed to take a DNA test. One of the people on this trip had carefully brought some DNA tests with them because DNA tests are illegal in Turkey. But one of the brothers agreed to take it, and Laura, of course, took one herself, took them home, took the kit home, and sent them in. It came back, and yes, of course, they were relatives. And they have kept in touch since then. Gregory Janikian, the Armenian poet some of you may know, was so kind to allow me to use his poem, which fits, I think, the pilgrims poignantly. And I can tell you that the dream I have is to walk back to this village and stand in the square for a moment, feeling the history of it on my skin, a history of departures and vanishings. That feeling on the skin is that spiritual feeling that I think I was able to feel. And I remember as I was gathering my material, years and years of notes, and then trying to put them in categories and thinking, what am I going to do with this? I was a fellow at the University of Texas at Austin. I had a mentor, a friend of mine, Denise Elberg, a very good scholar, and we'd sit at dinner and I'd say, you know what, Denise, I don't think I'm a real scholar because what I am feeling is something very spiritual. And I feel like I'm writing a history of the soul. And she said, go with it. That's what you're feeling. That's what you see. That's what you're going to write. That's what you're hearing today. So we have seen how that feeling on their skin was a spiritual feeling. And we've also seen how these descendant pilgrims now look at this part of Armenia as crucial to their identity and have to be there because no other place can offer to them what they need. They became agents by these rituals in what this Armenia was going to be for them. And I was constantly amazed that they took from it something that would nurture them rather than something that would kill them, which could easily happen. And so that's how they use this spirituality to nourish themselves. It doesn't mean in any way a healing of genocide. There's no healing to genocide, but this is on another level that I feel is permanent, a permanent connection. And now they have another chance, which may or may not happen, of agency as they meet this huge population of descendants of Armenians who are actually the same generation as themselves. I point to myself because it's my generation too, who are their relatives. And going back to the scariest place on earth is not going to a place that is empty of Armenians. And in fact, it has the possibility of a really deep connection for them to their own histories that for them seemed to have ended in 1915. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lots of people in the chat are writing that they were very happy with the event and very grateful to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariana, and thank you, Carel. We don't have too much more time for questions. If you're here or online, feel free to write.
Please.
Is on the screen.
I would love it.
To hear back from you. For all of you who are present here, just stay with us. We'll have some time to mingle and have some wine. And again, please join me on thanking Carel Bertram for the